How do innocent people end up in prison? This week, we investigate how miscarriages of justice happen, from disclosure failures and false confessions to tunnel vision, flawed expert evidence and institutional defensiveness. Featuring the cases of Sally Clark, Andrew Malkinson, Peter Sullivan and the Cardiff Three, we explore the deeper failures behind wrongful convictions in the UK. We also ask whether artificial intelligence could help prevent future miscarriages of justice, and examine the growing controversy surrounding the Court of Appeal. Stay until the end for the latest criminal appeals reform proposals and the growing debate over whether the justice system is truly capable of correcting its own mistakes.
Welcome to Spoken Injustice, where we put the criminal justice system in the dock. While we reconnect, settle back in and continue organising this project, Spoken Injustice, with the aim of involving as many expert guests as possible, I thought it would be worthwhile to revisit the wider issue of wrongful convictions and miscarriages of justice. How do these failures occur? Why are innocent people convicted in the first place? And once mistakes are made, how and how often are they ever truly corrected? We should also examine what can be done to prevent these injustices before they happen, as well as the mechanisms available to expose and overturn them afterwards. Could emerging technologies such as AI become part of the solution, or do they risk creating entirely new forms of injustice? Most importantly, what reforms, safeguards and innovations are currently being proposed to improve the fairness, transparency and reliability of the criminal justice system? We will examine this latter part at the end, so stay with us until the end to have the full picture. Because perhaps the most disturbing feature of miscarriages of justice, as we have said before, is not simply that mistakes happen. Human systems will always make mistakes. The deeper problem here is what happens once institutions become convinced they are right, and how difficult it then becomes for evidence, doubt, or even innocence itself to penetrate that certainty. In other words, this is an opportunity to start connecting the dots between the many cases, system failures, and warning signs we have touched on so far. So settle in and join me on a journey through one of the most troubling realities of any criminal justice system: miscarriages of justice. Together we will explore not only how those failures happen, but the deeper institutional, psychological and systemic dynamics that allow them to persist before finally turning to the growing calls, current reforms and emerging attempts to prevent these injustices from happening again. If you think criminal justice is achieved simply through punishment of the guilty, then you have a very limited understanding of justice. Because justice also requires the protection of the innocent. Imagine being accused of a crime you did not commit. Now imagine nobody believes you. For many people in the UK, this has not been hypothetical. Some spent years, even decades in prison before finally being proven innocent.
I came to the police station in 2003 and told the officers I was innocent. They didn't believe me. I came to the Crown Court in Manchester in 2004 and told the jury I was innocent. They didn't believe me. I came to this appeal court in 2006 and told them I was innocent. They didn't believe me. I applied to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which is supposed to investigate miscarriages of justice, and told them I was innocent. They didn't investigate, and they didn't believe me. Not once, but twice. Today we told this court I was innocent, and finally they listened. But I have been innocent all along.
Some died before their names were cleared, and others are still fighting today. When people think about miscarriages of justice, they often imagine dramatic conspiracy or rare accidents. But in reality, wrongful convictions are usually built through ordinary processes. A missed document, a mistaken witness, an overconfident expert, a rushed investigation, a jury persuaded by emotion, or an institution unwilling to admit they got things wrong. And more often than not, it is not one single failure, but the accumulation of many, each reinforcing the next until the system itself becomes convinced of guilt. This is the story of how miscarriages of justice happen in practice, and why the system still struggles not only to prevent these failures, but to recognize them once they happen. So what is a miscarriage of justice? A miscarriage of justice happens when the criminal justice system reaches the wrong outcome. Most commonly, this means an innocent person is convicted. And in our system, overturning a conviction is extremely difficult. Once a jury delivers a guilty verdict, the system places enormous importance on something called finality. In other words, the system wants verdicts to stay settled. Appeal courts do not simply retry cases because someone claims innocence. Instead, they ask a narrower legal question: was the conviction legally unsafe? That distinction matters enormously, because someone can be factually innocent and still struggle to overturn their conviction. And perhaps the most unsettling reality is that we only know about the miscarriages of justice that are eventually discovered. How many others remain hidden? How many people were never believed? How many mistakes were simply absorbed into the system and forgotten? Now, let's look at the causes. One of the biggest causes of wrongful conviction today is disclosure failure. This happens when police, prosecutors, or other third parties, including expert witnesses, fail to provide evidence that could assist the defense. That evidence might include witness statements, forensic material, medical reports, phone records, digital evidence, or in general information pointing toward alternative explanations. Modern criminal investigations generate enormous amounts of information, but critics argue disclosure systems are increasingly overwhelmed, inconsistent, and under-resourced. And sometimes evidence is not merely overlooked, sometimes it is withheld, buried, or never properly pursued at all. One of the clearest examples is the case of Sally Clark. Sally Clark was wrongly convicted in 1999 of murdering her two infant sons. During the trial, the prosecution relied heavily on expert medical testimony suggesting that deaths were extremely unlikely to have occurred naturally. But crucial microbiology evidence was never disclosed to the defense. A report held by one of the prosecution experts contained results suggesting one of the babies may have suffered from a serious bacterial infection, evidence that could have supported a natural cause of death. The defense never saw it. The report only surfaced years later. Sally Clark's conviction was eventually overturned in 2003, but by then the psychological and emotional damage had already been done. She never recovered from the ordeal and later died of alcohol intoxication. Another cause of miscarriages of justice is memory and misidentification. Jurors tend to trust confident testimony. After all, hearing someone say, "That's the man who attacked me," can feel incredibly persuasive. But decades of psychological research show that human memory is not a perfect recording. Memory changes. It reconstructs itself. It absorbs stress, suggestion, trauma, expectation, and time. And once investigators become convinced they have identified the right suspect, that certainty can begin shaping the entire decision of a case. One modern example of this is the case of Andrew Malkinson. Andrew Malkinson was convicted of rape in 2004. He always maintained his innocence. The prosecution case relied heavily on identification evidence and the growing confidence among investigators that they had found the right man. But over time, serious concerns began to emerge surrounding both the reliability of the evidence and the way the investigation itself had been conducted. Years later, as we know, advanced DNA testing identified another man linked to the attack. After spending 17 years in prison, Malkinson's conviction was finally overturned in 2023. Cases like this expose a deeply uncomfortable reality about human memory and criminal investigations. Research consistently shows that confidence and accuracy are not the same thing. A witness can be entirely sincere and entirely mistaken. But perhaps even more troubling are reports suggesting that uncertainty may have existed much earlier than the system was willing to acknowledge. During the later trial of Paul Quinn, the man ultimately identified through DNA evidence as the real perpetrator, it emerged that the victim appears to have expressed doubts to the police during the original proceedings about whether Andrew Malkinson was in fact her attacker. According to reports, those concerns were never given the weight they may have deserved once investigators had become convinced they had the right suspect. That issue is now expected to become an important focus of the ongoing public inquiry in the case. Then there is false confessions. Perhaps one of the most disturbing realities in criminal justice is that innocent people sometimes confess. At first glance, that seems impossible. Why would anyone admit to a crime they did not commit? But psychologists and legal experts have identified many reasons. Some suspects are exhausted after prolonged interrogations. Some are vulnerable because of age, mental health, difficulties, learning disabilities. Others begin to believe cooperation is the only way to escape pressure, and some become psychologically overwhelmed by the process itself. One of the most disturbing modern examples is the case of Peter Sullivan. Sullivan was convicted in 1987 for the murder of Diane Sindel and spent decades in prison maintaining his innocence. The case against him relied heavily on confession evidence obtained during police interviews, despite he later recanted them. Serious concerns surrounding the reliability of those admissions and inconsistencies within the investigation. Critics later argued that Sullivan was psychologically vulnerable and subjected to intense questioning that produced unreliable statements. Over time, growing doubts emerged about both the forensic evidence and the investigative process itself. Almost 40 years later, advances in DNA testing ultimately excluded Sullivan as the perpetrator. After spending nearly 4 decades imprisoned for a crime he did not commit, his conviction was finally overturned. The case exposed a deeply uncomfortable reality. Confession evidence can appear extraordinarily persuasive to juries, even when those confessions are unreliable, inconsistent, or produced under psychological pressure. Because once someone appears to admit guilt, the entire investigation can begin revolving around that assumption. And from that point onwards, innocence becomes increasingly difficult to see. But continuing our examination of the causes of miscarriages of justice, one issue that we have explored in considerable depth, particularly in the aftermaths of the Lucy Lebby case, is the role and influence of expert testimony. Expert testimony carries enormous authority in court. Jurors often assume scientific evidence is objective, neutral, almost infallible, but scientific evidence can be misunderstood, can be overstated, contaminated, statistically misleading, or based on flawed methods. One of the most tragic examples is the case of Sally Clark, again, that we mentioned earlier. A medical expert told the jury the probability of 2 natural cause deaths occurring in an Afrid family was 1 in 73 million. The statistics sounded devastating, but it was deeply misleading. Later experts explained the calculation was scientifically flawed and presented in a high deceptive way. As we can see, miscarriages of justice are rarely caused by a single catastrophic mistake. More often, as we said before, they emerge from a combination of failure that reinforce one another until the entire system becomes convinced of guilt. In Sally Clark's case, the non-disclosure of crucial microbiology evidence mentioned earlier, combined with deeply flawed statistical reasoning presented to the jury, created the perfect storm. Together, these failures transformed uncertainty into apparent certainty and helped construct a narrative of guilt that was both scientifically unreliable and fundamentally unfair. The case became one of the most disturbing examples of how disclosure failures and statistical inaccuracies can completely undermine the integrity of a criminal trial. Because juries can only assess the evidence they are permitted to see and only interpret it through the framework presented to them. A trial, therefore, may appear fair on the surface, while crucial evidence remains hidden and deeply misleading claims go unchallenged. And once those failures combine, the consequences can be devastating. And another major cause of miscarriages of justice, something known as tunnel vision. This happens when investigators become convinced of a suspect's guilt early in an investigation. Once that belief takes hold, evidence can become to get interpreted through a single narrative. Contradictions are minimized, alternative suspects receive less attention, ambiguous evidence become incriminating, and gradually the investigation stops asking who committed the crime and starts asking how do we prove the case against the person we already suspect. We must stress this is not always deliberate corruption. Often it is human psychology. People naturally search for evidence that confirms what they already believe. Goes without saying that police, though, should be trained to look for the alternative evidence. So perhaps the excuse doesn't hold there. One of the clearest examples in our criminal justice system history is the case of the Cardiff Three. The Cardiff Three were wrongly convicted for the murder of Lynette White in Cardiff, occurred in 1988. The investigation came under enormous public pressure and attracted intense national media attention. Although detectives initially stated they were searching for a white suspect, police later arrested 5 black and mixed-race local men, 3 of whom were eventually convicted. The argument here is that investigators rapidly fixated on this group despite serious weaknesses, contradictions, and inconsistency in the evidence against them. As the investigation progressed, the focus appeared to shift away from objectively determining who committed the crime and towards building a case against suspects the police had already convinced themselves were guilty. Several confessions obtained during police interviews were later criticized as unreliable and contradictory. In reality, investigators had developed what critics refer to as tunnel vision, interpreting evidence through the assumption that they already had the right suspects. The convictions were eventually overturned in 1992 after the Court of Appeal concluded the confessions were unsafe. But the most disturbing part of the story came afterward, because while the wrong men were imprisoned, the real perpetrator remained free. It was not until many years later, in 2003, that advances in DNA testing finally identified the real killer as Jeffrey Gaffar. Wrongful convictions do not only simply destroy innocent lives, they can also allow genuine offenders to evade justice entirely. But what about the appeal system itself? What role does it play in miscarriages of justice? And why can correcting wrongful convictions be so extraordinarily difficult? Many people assume that if an innocent person is convicted, the appeal system will eventually correct the mistake. But the reality is far more complicated. In England and Wales, the criminal appeal system has been accused of placing greater emphasis on protecting the finality of convictions than actively investigating factual innocence. In other words, the system is often more concerned with preserving the authority of previous verdicts rather than questioning whether the right person was convicted in the first place. The criticism sits at the heart of modern debates surrounding miscarriages of justice. In the 70s and 80s, after scandals such as the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4, public confidence in the appellate system collapsed. The result, as we know, was the creation of the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the CCRC, an independent body designed to investigate possible wrongful convictions after normal appeals had failed. Its purpose was simple: to stop the justice system from bearing its own mistakes. But with time, the CCRC became part of that system. Campaigners, lawyers, and academics argued that the CCRC has become overly cautious, institutionally defensive, under-resourced, and reluctant to challenge unsafe convictions aggressively. However, increasingly, attention has turned toward the Court of Appeal itself. The Observer only recently reported, in the words of some critics, the Court of Appeal exists in a position beyond reproach, beyond accountability, and beyond reform. Why? Partly because almost nobody wants to publicly challenge senior judges. Politicians in particular are understandably cautious about interfering with judicial independence. But critics argue that this caution has also allowed the Court of Appeal to avoid the level of scrutiny and structural reform applied to almost every other part of the criminal justice system over the last 50 years. But is it all doom and gloom as the Observer describes? In reality, some signs of change may finally be emerging. First came unusually strong criticism from the Supreme Court in the cases of Hayes and Palombo, a rare and institutionally significant rebuke directed towards the approach of the Court of Appeal. In the opening paragraph of its judgment, the Supreme Court states the history of these two cases raises concerns about the effectiveness of the criminal appeal system in England and Wales in confronting legal error, making clear that the convictions may have depended upon a fundamentally flawed legal approach that had already been repeatedly endorsed by the Court of Appeal over several years. The judgment emphasised that the Court of Appeal had consistently upheld directions given to juries which, according to the Supreme Court, improperly removed key factual questions from the jury's consideration altogether. The Supreme Court ultimately concluded that the lower courts had adopted a novelly rigid and unrealistic interpretation of the law, one that failed to reflect the practical realities of the financial markets involved in the case. The significance of the case extended far beyond financial crime itself, because it raised a much broader and deeply uncomfortable question. If the Court of Appeal can repeatedly uphold unsafe reasoning over many years and only be corrected after intervention from the Supreme Court, then how many other flawed convictions may remain embedded within the system? That is why Hayes and Palombo become, in our view, important, not simply as individual appeals, but as part of a growing debate about accountability, scrutiny, and whether the criminal appeal system has become too institutionally resistant to correcting its own errors. Then came proposals from the Law Commission that could fundamentally reshape criminal appeals. At present, If someone wishes to appeal from the Court of Appeal to the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeal itself must certify that the case raises an issue of law of general public importance. This creates a deeply unusual situation. The Court of Appeal effectively controls which of its own decisions can be reviewed by the higher court. Makes no sense. The Law Commission, in its latest proposal on criminal appeals, has proposed removing that requirement. If implemented, more criminal appeals could reach the Supreme Court directly, potentially exposing the Court of Appeal to a level of scrutiny that it has largely avoided for decades. But in our view, beneath all of this lies a much deeper question. What is the true purpose of a criminal appeal system? Is it primarily to preserve certainty and institutional stability? Or is it to pursue truth, even if that means admitting the justice system sometimes gets things catastrophically wrong? Until that question is confronted honestly, miscarriages of justice will continue not only to happen, but to remain uncorrected for years. Now, having exposed some of the most recurring causes of miscarriages of justice, let us now turn to perhaps the most important question of all: prevention. Could artificial intelligence become part of the solution in reducing wrongful convictions and improving the reliability of the justice system? I'll say possibly, but we must remain cautious because it could also create entirely new forms of injustice if implemented carelessly. Modern criminal cases involve overwhelming quantities of information: messages, CCTV footage, phone downloads, digital records, forensic documents. Human investigators and lawyers cannot realistically review everything perfectly. AI systems could potentially identify undisclosed evidence, detect inconsistencies, compare timelines, flag alternative suspects, and help review historic convictions. In theory, AI could function almost like a disclosure auditor. It could also help expose tunnel vision by forcing investigators to confront contradictory evidence. And for underfunded defense teams, AI tools could dramatically improve the ability to review complex evidence. But there are serious dangers too, some that we have already touched upon. AI systems learn from historical data, and criminal justice system data already contains racial biases, institutional assumptions. If trained badly, AI could simply automate existing injustice at a larger scale. There is also the danger of overtrust. Jurors already tend to overtrust forensic experts. Imagine the persuasive power of the algorithm says he's guilty, even when the algorithm itself may be flawed, opaque, or wrong. There is a deeper irony here. Many of the miscarriages of justice we have explored were caused by excessive confidence in supposedly reliable systems, expert witnesses, forensic methods, investigative assumptions, institutional judgment. The danger with AI is that it may simply become the next system people trust too much. But perhaps the most alarming issue of all, future miscarriages of justice may involve AI-generated evidence itself. deep fake audio, manipulated CCTV, synthetic messages, false digital evidence. In other words, AI may become both a tool for exposing injustice and a tool for manufacturing it. So perhaps the real question is not, can AI deliver justice? But rather, can we build AI systems that remain accountable to justice? And what do you think about the growing role of AI in criminal justice? Could it help prevent miscarriages of justice, or might it become another source of them? Let me know in the comments below. Ultimately, a miscarriage of justice harms everyone. The innocent person loses years, sometimes decades of their lives. Families are shattered, not only the family of the wrongly convicted, but often the family of the original victim as well, forced to endure years of false closure built upon the wrong conviction. Public trust in justice is undermined. And when the wrong person is convicted, the real offender remains free to harm others. And perhaps the most disturbing truth of all is that the miscarriage of justice we hear about are probably only a fraction of those that truly exist. Many are never uncovered. Some innocent people die still carrying the label of guilt. Others disappear quietly into obscurity, forgotten not because justice was achieved, but because the system never found the courage to admit it was wrong. The criminal justice system is built on an extraordinary power, the power to remove someone's freedom. And any system with that level of power must constantly question itself, not only when it succeeds, but especially when it fails. Because the greatest threat to justice is not simply that mistakes happen. The real danger begins when institutions become so invested in their own certainty that admitting error becomes harder than preserving injustice itself. I hope this journey through the causes of miscarriages of justice, the devastating human impact they leave behind, and the urgent reforms still needed, has helped paint a fuller picture of why this issue matters so deeply and why we continue to speak so passionately about it. Because justice is not measured only by the conviction of the guilty, but by the protection of the innocent. If you believe these conversations matter, subscribe to the channel and support our mission to humanize the criminal justice system. Join us again as we sit and rise in this unique trial.